What if Lyanna Stark survived? Not easily. Not cleanly. She was dying when Ned found her. The fever and the blood and the specific finality of a body that has given everything it had and is deciding whether to continue. She was dying and Jon was in her arms, and she asked Ned for the promise, and he gave it, and then, in this version, in this history, the Maester arrived in time. Just in time. 2 hours later would have been nothing. 2 hours earlier would have been simple. But the Maester arrived and Lyanna Stark lived. And what followed from that one fact was the most complicated 15 years of anyone's life who was connected to it. Because Lyanna surviving did not simplify anything. It made everything harder. The lie was still the lie. Jon's parentage was still the secret that could get him killed if Robert found out. Still the truth that could unravel the realm if it was handled wrong. Rhaegar was dead at the Trident, and his other children were dead in King's Landing, and the dynasty was over. And none of that changed because Lyanna could walk out of the Tower of Joy on her own feet, instead of being carried home in a box. What changed was, the secret had a voice now. The secret was a woman who had chosen her fate with open eyes and refused to regret it, who was Ned Stark's sister and Brandon Stark's sister, and the daughter of their father before all of them, who came home to Winterfell with a son, and a story nobody was allowed to tell, and a grief she had chosen and wouldn't pretend away. What changed was, Jon Snow had a mother, and Lyanna Stark had to figure out how to be that in a world that required her son to be no one. The Tower of Joy, Dawn, 283 AC. The Maester's name was Aldrich. He was an old man who had been Maester to a Dornish household for 40 years, and who had been called to the tower by a servant who had been bribed, and who had made his way up the narrow stairs to find Ned Stark's sister with a newborn son, and the specific grey quality of someone running out of time. He worked for 6 hours. Ned sat outside the door for those 6 hours, with Howland Reed beside him, and the bodies of 3 Kingsguard in the courtyard below, and the new world settling into its shape around them. He had the promise. He'd made the promise while Lyanna was still conscious enough to extract it, before the fever had peaked, before the Maester had arrived, and the situation had changed its nature from terminal to possibly survivable. The promise was still the promise. When Aldrich came out and said she was alive, said it with the flat economy of a man delivering medical information rather than news, she will likely survive. The fever has broken. She is weak. Ned sat in the dust of the Dornish stairwell and put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for a long time. Howland Reed beside him. What do you want to do? Ned said, I don't know yet. He didn't know for 3 days, which was how long it took Lyanna to be strong enough to have the conversation. She lay in the bed with Jon beside her, and she looked at the ceiling, and she looked at her son, and she looked at Ned when he came in and said, I know what you're thinking. He said, You don't know what I'm thinking. She said, You're thinking the plan is harder now. He said, The plan is impossible now. A bastard with no mother is a bastard. A bastard with a mother who is Lyanna Stark is something else entirely. She said, I'm not going to abandon him. I didn't ask you to. You were about to. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the dark grey eyes that were his eyes and their father's eyes, the eyes that ran in Stark blood for generations, and he saw in them the same thing he always saw in her, the specific, absolute quality of someone who has decided something and is not being changed. He said, What do you want to do? She said, Go home. Lyanna, go home to Winterfell, all 3 of us. She looked at the baby. I'm not asking you to lie about who he is. I'm asking you to help me protect him. She looked back at Ned. You were going to do it alone. Do it with me. He thought about Catelyn, who was in Winterfell carrying Robb. He thought about Robert, who would come to Winterfell eventually, and who would see his dead betrothed alive with a child and no husband, and would make a calculation that had a very specific and violent result. He said, You know what Robert will... I know what Robert will do if he knows the truth. She held his gaze. So he doesn't know the truth. He knows what you tell him. And you tell him. She paused. You tell him I was taken against my will. You tell him the night kept me against my will. and that what happened wasn't a choice I made, and that Jon is... She stopped. Something crossing her face that was not grief exactly, but the cousin of it, the specific cost of what she was about to say. Jon is what happened to me, not something I wanted, Ned said. You'd let people believe that. She said, I'd let people believe what keeps my son alive. She looked at Jon again. He is what I wanted. That's the truth I live with. What the world believes is different. He sat beside her on the bed. He looked at his nephew, who was sleeping with the profound completeness of a very new person who has not yet been told that the world is complicated. He said, Robert will want proof. She said, I'm the proof. I'm here. I'm alive. And if I say I was kept against my will, who tells Robert Baratheon it's a lie? His grief is going to want it to be true. She looked at Ned. He loved me. That love needs a story. That doesn't make me a betrayer. Give him that story. And Jon. Jon is my son. By a man who is dead. She said it flatly. That's all anyone needs to know. He said, that's not all Catelyn will need to know. No. She was quiet for a moment. Catelyn, I'll talk to myself. He looked at her. She said, she deserves the truth. You asked her to accept a secret for you. She should know the actual shape of it. She paused. And she should hear it from me. Woman to woman, about what I chose and why, and what I'm asking of her. Ned thought about his wife and the conversation to come, and about the specific grace it would require of Catelyn to receive it. He thought, she will find the grace. He thought, she always does, at a cost. He said, we leave in a week. When you're strong enough to travel? She said, I'll be strong enough in 4 days. He said, a week. She said, 5 days. He said, fine. She looked at Jon. She said, he needs a name. He said, I know. She said, not Aegon, not any Targaryen name. She looked up at him. They'll come looking someday, maybe, if someone figures out what he is. Not by the name. He said, what name? She said, Jon. After Jon Arryn. She paused. He's the one who kept Robert sane during the war. He's the one who made sure you had time to find me. He deserves something. Ned said, Jon Stark. She was quiet for a moment. She said, not Stark. If he's Stark by name, the questions start immediately. She looked at her son. Jon Snow. A bastard name for a bastard's cover. He's mine. His name says, I had him out of wedlock, and his father is gone. That's all. Jon Snow. Ned said it to himself. The name that would carry the secret, and carry the boy, and carry the weight of everything Lyanna was asking of it. He said, all right, she said. Jon Snow of Winterfell. My son. Winterfell. The return. 283 AC. The return to Winterfell was not triumphant. Returns from wars rarely were, and this one less than most. Ned came home with his sister alive and a secret, and the particular weight of men he'd ridden south with who had not come back. He came home to Catelyn, who had delivered Robb and who looked at Lyanna's baby, and made the calculation she was obviously going to make. Lyanna went to her. She did it the day after they arrived, before Ned could manage the conversation, before anyone in the household had time to develop a settled opinion. She went to Catelyn sola, and she closed the door, and she told her the truth. Not all of it. Not Rhaegar's name. That was the part that could get Jon killed. The part that connected him to the Targaryen claim. She told her, I chose to go. I chose Rhaegar. I was not taken. I was not forced. What happened was what I wanted, and I knew what it would cost, and I paid it, and I don't regret it, except that he died. She told her, Jon's father is dead, and his blood is dangerous, and if you want to know the name, I'll tell you, but you should understand what knowing it means for you. Catelyn did not ask for the name. She sat very still for a long time. She said, You're asking me to raise your son alongside mine. Lyanna said, I'm asking you to let me raise my son in Ned's household. He won't be your burden. He's mine. Catelyn said, You think that's a distinction that will hold? Lyanna said, It has to. Catelyn looked at her. She was a Tully, and she had been raised in the South, and she understood politics as a language. And she was reading Lyanna right now with the full force of a very intelligent woman who had been handed a very complicated situation. She said, "Ned will love him." Lyanna said, "Yes." She said, "He'll love him the same as Rob and the children will have. He won't be able to help it. No, he won't. And the household will see that, and they'll think what Ned lets them think." Lyanna held her gaze. "Which is that Jon is mine, by a man I met during the war who is gone. A bastard I claim and raise at Winterfell." Catelyn said, "That puts shame on you. I've had worse." She said it without drama. The story of Lyanna Stark, who ran off during a war and came back with a bastard, is not flattering. I know that. I'm choosing it. Catelyn looked at her hands, then at Lyanna. She said, "You're very like Ned." "Most people say Ned is like me. A ghost of something. He's the younger one." Catelyn said, "I'm going to need time." Lyanna said, "I know." She said, "He cannot be presented as mine. If anyone asks, he's mine. Only mine." Lyanna was clear. "You will never be asked to claim him or defend him or explain him. He is my responsibility." Catelyn said, "And if I cannot, if there are days when I cannot, then you don't." Lyanna said it without accusation. "I'm not asking you to love him. I'm asking you to let him live here." A silence. The fire. The cold outside. Catelyn said, "All right." She said it the way you say things when you've looked at the full weight of them and decided they're worth carrying. Not light. Not relieved. Just, "All right." Lyanna said, "Thank you." They did not become close. Not immediately. Not easily. But over years, in the shared work of running a household and raising children and managing the specific, relentless demands of Winterfell in winter, something built between them. Not warmth, not quite, but the respect of two women who had each found out that the other was more than expected. It was enough. It had to be enough. Winterfell. Robert comes. 283 AC. Robert came to Winterfell in the first winter after the war. He came because Lyanna was alive, and he needed to see her. He came because he was king now, and the North was part of his realm, and Ned Stark was his oldest friend, and Winterfell was the visit that the politics of the new reign required. He came, Ned thought, because he hadn't decided yet what he felt about any of it. Lyanna received him in the Great Hall. She had thought about this for 4 months. She had thought about the specific staging of it, where to stand, what to wear, what face to put on the thing, and she had discarded all of it and decided to do what she had always done, which was to simply be what she was and let it land where it landed. She was standing by the window when he came in. He stopped. He had been king for 3 months. He was wearing it already the way Robert wore things he hadn't decided about yet, which was loudly and incompletely. He was 20 years old and enormous, and the specific, particular sadness that had been building in him since the trident was visible on his face in a way that he probably didn't know and wouldn't have corrected even if he had. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He said, "You're alive." She said, "Yes." He said, I know what you thought." She kept her voice even. "I almost was." He crossed the hall in a way that was not quite running, and it would have been an embrace if she'd let it. But she stepped back, and he stopped, and they stood 2 feet apart, and he looked at her face. She said, "I know what you want me to say." He said, "I don't. You want me to say it wasn't my fault, that I didn't choose it, that I was taken and kept, and that everything you went to war for was the right thing." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to say that, Robert." He stared at her. She said, "I'm also not going to say what actually happened, because what actually happened is something you're not ready to hear, and I'm not ready to have that conversation." She paused. "What I am going to say is that it's over. He's dead. I'm alive. And I have a son He had not known about the son until that morning. Ned had told him before he came in, briefly, the essential facts. She had a child. A boy. He was born during her captivity. He's at Winterfell. Robert's face had done something that Ned had watched carefully and had not been able to entirely read. Now, in the hall, Robert looked at Lyanna and said, "The child," she said, "is mine. He stays here. He's no one's business but mine. And his father is dead." She held his gaze. "He died in the war. That's the end of that story." Robert was quiet for a long time. He was 20 years old, and he had just fought a war for this woman, and she was standing in front of him alive and changed and holding something that was hers in a way that excluded him entirely. And the specific grief of that, the grief of someone who fought for something and arrived to find that fighting for it had not made it his, was something he was experiencing in real time. He said, "I would have." "I know." She said it almost gently. "I know what you would have done. What you still would do. Probably, if I asked you." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you, Robert. I'm asking you to go away and be king and let me be in the north." He looked at her. He said, "Is that really what you want?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And the boy is not a Baratheon concern." She said it without cruelty, but with the absolute finality of a woman who had decided where her lines were and was not moving them. "He's Lyanna Stark's bastard. Nothing more." Robert was quiet for a very long time. He sat down. He hadn't been invited to sit. He sat anyway, in the chair by the table, and he put his elbows on his knees, and he looked at the floor. He said, "I wanted to marry you." She said, "I know." He said, "I thought about it for years. How it would be." He looked up. "I never thought about you. That's the problem. I thought about what I wanted, not what you wanted." She looked at him. She said, "You're going to be a better king for understanding that." He said, "Am I?" She said, "Probably not. You're also going to be a worse one for all the other things about you." A pause. "But you understood something just now. Keep it." He looked at her. He said, "I'd like to see him." She said, "I'll think about it." He said, "Lyanna." She said, "I'll think about it. That's all I'm saying right now." He nodded. He stood. He went to the door. He stopped. He said, "I'm sorry. For everything." She said, "I know you are." He said, "Does it help?" She thought about it. She said, "A little. Yes." He left. She stood by the window for a long time after he was gone. She had not shown Robert her son that day. She showed him the next day, briefly, in the yard. She held Jon while Robert crouched down and looked at the boy with the dark hair and the grey eyes that were Stark eyes and that gave nothing away. And she watched Robert look and watched the calculation he ran and watched him decide not to run it to its conclusion. Robert said, "He has your eyes." She said, "Yes." He said, "He's Stark all over." She said, "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Then he stood and he clapped Ned on the shoulder and he said something about the hunting and the conversation was over. He never asked again. Winterfell. The early years. 283 to 290 AC. Jon grew up knowing he was Lyanna's. Not the rest of it, not Rhaegar, not the Tower of Joy, not the weight of what his blood meant in a world that would not welcome it. That was held for later, for when he was old enough. And Lyanna and Ned had had the conversation about when old enough was several times and had never quite settled it. What he knew was his mother. He had that when other children in his position didn't. And he knew it was rare. And he knew it was the most important fact of his life before he was old enough to understand why. Lyanna was not a soft mother. She had not been a soft person before the war, and the war had not softened her further. She was the woman who had been a better rider than half the men in the north at 15, and who had kept Ned humble about it since they were children, and who had decided, in the Tower of Joy, to live, and who was making good on that decision every day. She was in the training yard when Jon was in the training yard, not supervising, not with the managed distance of a noblewoman watching from a gallery, standing at the edge of the yard in the way of someone who understood what they were watching, which she did. She had trained in the same yard with Ned, when their father wasn't watching, and she recognized competence when she saw it, and she corrected incompetence when she saw that. She told Jon things that the yardmaster didn't tell him. She said, "Your strength will always be less than the men you'll fight when you're grown. Stop trying to match it. Use what you have." She said, "Speed is the thing they're not expecting from you. Be faster than they expect. Always." She said, "The moment you decide you've won a fight is the moment you lose it." He absorbed all of it. He was 8, 9, 10, absorbing everything she gave him with the focused attention of a boy who understood that what his mother knew was something different from what the yardmaster knew, and that both were necessary. Robb was his brother in every way that mattered. This was Lyanna's doing specifically. She had thought about it, and she had made a decision early that Jon was not going to grow up in the household as a guest, as a tolerated presence, as the bastard at the wrong table. He ate at the table. He trained alongside Robb and Theon, and later the others. He was not a Stark by name, and he was of the household in every other way, and Lyanna had achieved this by the simple expedient of making it so, and refusing to entertain alternatives. Ned had backed her on this completely. Catelyn had found her footing with it over time. Jon didn't know how much effort had gone into the normalness of his life. He would find out later, when he was old enough for the full accounting, and the finding out would be its own kind of cost. But in the years when he was simply growing up, he grew up with the specific, unusual gift of a child who is loved without complication, and who does not know yet that this is unusual. He grew up close to Robb. They were the same age near enough, Jon months older, Robb months younger, and they had the specific relationship of boys who have been placed in the same orbit and have found each other essential. They fought with the practiced regularity of siblings and reconciled with the speed of people who don't have many alternatives. Robb was louder and Jon was quieter, and together they produced the specific average of noise that a Winterfell childhood seemed to require. He grew up close to Arya, who arrived 5 years after him and who was immediately recognizable to him as a kind of person he understood. She had the quality Lyanna had, the refusal to stay where the world had put her, the specific will to be where she decided to be. And Jon saw his mother in his youngest sister and loved her for it, even before he understood what he was seeing. He grew up knowing the stories. Lyanna told them, not the official stories, not the war stories that adults told in halls, and that made things clean and large and appropriate for the telling. The real ones. She told him about their father, about the North, and what it asked of the people who held it, about Brandon who died in King's Landing, and what that death had meant, and what you were supposed to do with a death that was that arbitrary and that wrong. She told him about the war. Not her part of it, not yet, but the shape of it, what it had been fought for, and who had fought it, and what it had cost. She told him, the world changes when people decide to do things differently. Most people don't decide. They do what they were told to do. The ones who change things are the ones who look at what they were told and ask why. He said, "Is that what you did?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Did it work?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'm still deciding." He didn't understand what she meant until much later. Winterfell. Lyanna and Ned. The long conversations. 285 to 295 AC. They talked about it for years, in the way of siblings who have a secret between them, and have to maintain it, and have to decide together when and how the maintaining changes. The conversation happened in pieces, over time, in the Solar and the Godswood and the battlements, and wherever they found themselves alone in a castle that was never entirely private. She said, when Jon was 2, Robert came through the south on progress. Someone saw a man in his retinue who looked like Rhaegar. He said, "There are dark-haired men in Westeros." She said, "I know that. Robert knows that. The question is when seeing one will remind him to look." He said, "Robert is not going to..." Robert is going to get drunk and remember eventually. He gets drunk and remembers everything. It's one of his primary activities. She looked at him. When he remembers the right thing at the right moment and looks at Jon's face. Jon looks like you. Jon looks like me. Jon also has eyes that are Ned. His eyes are grey, but they have something in them. She said it carefully. Rhaegar had eyes that were an unusual grey, more silver. Jon's eyes are darker. But there's something, he said. I think you're seeing what you're afraid of. She said, I've been seeing it every morning for 2 years. I know the difference between what I'm afraid of and what's real. He was quiet. She said, we need to talk about what happens when it stops working. The story. When someone looks and sees the wrong thing. He said, what do you want to have ready? She said, I want Jon to know before someone else tells him. Not all of it, not now. But something. She looked at the fire. I want him to know he's mine. I want him to know there are things I'll tell him when he's older. I want him to have a shape for it. Even if it's not the full shape yet. He said, you think the partial truth protects better than the full ignorance? She said, I think partial truth gives him something to hold on to when the full truth arrives. A foundation. She looked at Ned. He's going to feel the ground shift when he finds out. I want there to be something solid underneath when it does. They talked about this for years. They talked about it when Jon was 4 and asking questions about his father that Lyanna answered with the careful version. He died in the war, before you were born. He was brave. They talked about it when Jon was 7 and a boy in the village had said bastard in a way that required explaining. And Lyanna had explained it to Jon with the flat, northern honesty she brought to everything. You are my son, and your father is gone, and in this world they give names to that. The name is wrong about what you are, but it is what the world will call you. Learn to carry it correctly. He had asked, how do you carry something incorrectly? She had said, by pretending it isn't there, or by letting it be the first thing. He said, what's the right way? She said, you carry it like a sword. You know it's there. You know what it can do. You don't forget it exists. But you're the one who decides when it matters. He had thought about this for days. He came back and said, I think I understand. She said, you don't yet. But you will. She had been right. He hadn't understood it at 7. He understood it at 12, and then more fully at 15. And the understanding deepened every year after that, in the way understanding deepened when the thing you were understanding kept becoming more real. Winter fell. The direwolves. 295 AC. The wolves appeared on the road in the way wolves appeared in Stark stories, without explanation and exactly when they were meant to. There were 6 of them, 5 for the Stark children and 1 for Jon and Lyanna, who had not believed in signs most of her adult life, and who had decided to believe in them where Jon was concerned, looked at the 6th wolf and looked at her son and said, nothing. Jon named his ghost. She asked him why. He said, he's the quietest one. He's always there, but you don't hear him coming. She looked at the white wolf with the red eyes. She thought about the Tower of Joy and the secret she'd been carrying and the way it sat in their lives. Present. Invisible. Always there. She said, that's a good name. She watched Jon with the wolf over the following weeks, watched how the animal fitted itself to him, the specific resonance between them that was not trained behavior, but something older. Ghost moved with Jon's moods before Jon had expressed them. Ghost positioned himself between Jon and threats that Jon hadn't seen yet. She had grown up in Winterfell. She knew what direwolves meant in northern stories. She thought, my son has a direwolf the same color as snow, the same color as the world when everything else has been covered, the color of something that was there all along. She thought, I should tell him. She thought, not yet. She thought, soon. Winterfell. Lyanna tells him. 296 AC. She told him when he was 13. Not because the timing was right. There was no right timing for this. She told him because a Braavosi merchant's son had passed through Winterfell with his father and had spent an evening at the Lord's table and had looked at Jon's face with the specific recognition of someone who was running a comparison. The merchant's son was 20 and had travelled widely and had seen things in the free cities that stuck. He hadn't said anything. He'd looked and then looked away. Lyanna had watched him look. She went to Jon that night. He was reading in his room. He'd been reading more lately. The histories and the records of the old dynasties, with the focused attention of a boy who is building toward a question he hasn't quite asked yet. Ghost was across his feet. She closed the door. She sat on the chest at the foot of his bed. He looked at her face and set down the book. She said, "I'm going to tell you something. I need you to let me tell it all the way through before you say anything." He said, "All right." She said, "Your father was not a Northman." He waited. She said, "He was not someone I met during the war. That story, the one that people in this castle believe, that story is a lie I chose to tell to keep you alive." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you because you deserve the truth, and because the lie becomes more dangerous the longer it holds. And there was a man at dinner tonight who I think is going to carry something back to someone who will think about it." Jon said nothing. He was looking at her with the grey eyes that were going to be the problem someday, the grey eyes with the thing in them that was hers but also not entirely hers. She said, "Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen, the prince. He was the crown prince of the dynasty that preceded Robert's reign." She watched him absorb this. He was 13, and he was intelligent, and he had been reading the dynasties, and he knew who Rhaegar was. She could see the information finding its place in the structure he'd been building, and shifting the structure, and then settling. He said, "Robert killed him." "Yes." "At the Trident." "Yes." "And Robert..." He stopped. Started again. "Robert thinks you were taken." "Yes." "You weren't." "No." She held his gaze. "I chose. I will tell you everything about what I chose, and why when you're older. What you need to know now is that I chose, and that the choice was mine, and that I don't regret it, except that he died." She paused. "What I regret is the cost it put on other people, on your Uncle Ned, on Lady Catelyn, on you." He said, "You didn't put a cost on me." She said, "I gave you a life that requires you to pretend to be less than you are." He said, "Everyone at Winterfell knows I'm your son." She said, "Everyone at Winterfell knows you're my bastard. They don't know what I am." He said it flat, not angry, working through it. "What does it mean, what I am?" She said, "By any strict reading of succession, by blood, you have a claim to the Iron Throne." She watched his face. "I am telling you this not because I want you to pursue it, or even think about it as something real. I am telling you because it is the truth, and because you need to know what people would see if they looked at you correctly." He was quiet for a very long time. Ghost stood up, walked to the head of the bed, turned in a circle, lay back down beside Jon's shoulder. The wolf understood something about the temperature of the room. Jon said, "Uncle Ned knows." "Yes, he's known since I was in the tower." "And Lady Catelyn." "She knows I chose. She doesn't know the name. I gave her the choice of knowing or not knowing, and she chose not to know." She paused. "Howland Reed knows the full truth. That's all." He said, 3 people. She said, 3 people for 13 years. "Yes." He said, "That's..." He stopped. He was calculating something. "You've been carrying this for 13 years. "Yes." He said, "With me in it. With you in it." She looked at him. "You are the point of the carrying, Jon, not the burden of it. I need you to understand the difference." He looked at her. He said, "Did you love him?" She knew who he meant. She said, "Yes." He said, "Do you regret him?" She said, "I told you. You said you don't regret the choice." "That's not what I asked." He was 13, and he had her precision, her tendency to go directly at the accurate thing. Do you regret him? Specifically? She was quiet. She said, No. He said, Even though everything. She held his gaze. He was someone I chose with my whole self, not with the part of me that weighed the political implications. With all of it, I have never regretted the whole self choice. She paused. I have spent 13 years managing the consequences of it. That's different. He sat with this. Ghost's tail moved slowly. Jon said, What do you want me to do with this? She said, Nothing yet. You're 13. You don't need to do anything with it yet. She looked at him. What I want you to understand is that you are real. What you are is real. The story the world has about you is wrong, and the truth of you is. She stopped. She was not a woman who said the soft things easily. You are exactly what I wanted. You are the thing that I chose with my whole self. That is what you are. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I need to think. She said, I know. She stood to leave. He said, Mum. She turned. He said, Thank you for telling me. She said, I should have told you earlier. He said, No. I think this is right. He paused. I think this is when I was ready. She looked at her son with the grey Stark eyes, and the blood of old Valyria in him, and the direwolf at his shoulder. She said, Yes, I think so too. Winter fell. The months after, 296 to 297 AC. He did not say anything about it for 4 days. He went about his life, training, eating, reading, the ordinary Winterfell routine, and he was quiet in a way that was slightly different from his usual quiet. The way a person is quiet when they are processing something large and need the ordinary fabric of days to process against. On the 5th day, he found Ned. Not in the hall or the solar, in the Godswood, which was where Ned went when he needed to think, and Jon had always known this, and had sometimes found him there by design, and sometimes by accident, and this was design. He sat beside his uncle. Ned looked at him. He knew what this was. Jon said, She told me. Ned said, I know. Were you waiting for her to? Yes. He was quiet. She was always going to be the one to tell you. It was her story to tell. Jon said, It's my story. Ned looked at him. Jon said, I don't mean that badly. I mean... He stopped. He was choosing his words with the care he'd developed. She made choices that created me. She gets to tell those choices, but what I am is mine. He looked at the heart tree. I've been thinking about that. Ned said, Tell me what you've been thinking. Jon said, I've been thinking about what it means to have a claim to something you didn't ask for. He paused. Lord Stark, when you became Lord of Winterfell after your father died and Brandon died, did you want it? Ned looked at the pool. He said, No, I was the second son. I wasn't built to be Lord. I was supposed to be in the Vale, learning. He paused, and then everything changed, and there I was. Jon said, Did you want it eventually? Ned said, I wanted to do it correctly. That's different from wanting it. He looked at Jon. You're asking if I think you should want what you are. Jon said, I'm asking if wanting it is the right response. Ned was quiet for a long time. He said, The right response is to understand it, not to want it or not want it. Those come later. Understanding first. Jon said, I understand that I'm Rhaegar's son. I understand that means something. Yes. I understand that Ned Stark spent 15 years lying to protect me. Yes. I understand that my mother chose something the world called wrong and has been paying for it every day and won't say she regrets it. He looked at his uncle. I think I understand all of it. What I don't understand is what to do with it. Ned said, Nothing yet. I keep hearing that. Because it's true. You're 13. The world is not going to present you with the moment yet. He looked at Jon. When it does, When the moment comes that requires you to be who you actually are, you'll know it. And you'll be ready for it. Jon said. How will I know? Ned said. Because it'll be the moment when the right thing and the hard thing are the same thing. He paused. It's always the same thing. That's how you know. Jon sat with this. The godswood was quiet. The pool reflected the heart tree. He said, I'm not going to tell Rob. Ned said, That's your choice. He said, Not yet. Maybe later. He paused. He thinks I'm just his brother. I'd like to keep being just his brother for a while. Ned said, You are his brother. That doesn't change. Jon said, I know. He stood. Uncle Ned. Ned said, Yes. Jon said, You gave me a good life. You and her together. You gave me a better life than I would have had any other way. He said it without ornament. Just the fact of it. I wanted you to know I know that. Ned looked at him. He said, You're your mother's son. Jon said, I'm going to take that as a compliment. He went back to the castle. Ned sat in the godswood for a long time after. King's Landing. The invitation. 298 AC. The invitation came from Robert. It came in the form of a raven to Ned, and also, separately, in the form of a personal letter to Lyanna. A thing that arrived rarely, and which Lyanna read by the fire in the solar, with the expression of someone translating from a language they know but don't speak comfortably. The invitation was, Come south. Ned to be my hand. You. I've thought about it for 15 years. Come south, Lyanna. Bring the boy if you want. There's room. She showed it to Ned. He read it. He said, What do you want to do? She said, I want to say no. But Jon is 15. He's been at Winterfell his whole life. If he's going to be what he is someday, he needs to know what the South is. She looked at the fire. He needs to understand what he'd be claiming. If he ever does. Ned said, This could also be exactly what goes wrong. She said, I know. She looked at him. Is there a version of this that doesn't eventually go wrong? Ned was quiet. She said, Right. So the question is, which version of wrong is manageable? He said, Going south with Jon means Robert seeing him regularly. She said, Robert has seen him. Twice. At Winterfell. He ran the comparison and decided not to finish it. She paused. If I control the context, if we're careful. We've been careful for 15 years. I know. It's harder in King's Landing. I know. She looked at him. Ned. I've been in the north my whole life. I had a year in Dawn and then back to the north, and that's been my life. She looked at the fire. I'm not going because I want to. I'm going because if I don't take Jon south now, on my terms, in my control, then someday something will take him south on someone else's terms. And that will be worse. He said, You've been planning this. She said, I've been planning everything since he was born. You know that. He said, All right, we go south. She said, Together. He said, Together. She said, And if it goes wrong? He said, We come home. She said, Yes. She looked at the letter. One way or another, we come home. King's Landing. Arrival. 298 AC. Jon had never been south of the Neck. The South was everything and nothing like the books. The books had conveyed the scale of it, the size of the city, the population, the specific noise of 500,000 people in close proximity, but not the quality of the noise, which was different from Winterfell's noise in the way that all southern things were different from northern things, which was louder and more immediate and less patient. He rode through the city gates with Ghost at his side. Ghost caused a reaction. This was, Lyanna told him later, something she'd planned for and had decided was actually useful. A direwolf in King's Landing was not a nothing. The small folk knew what direwolves meant, knew they ran in Stark blood, and the reaction said, Here is someone connected to the North in a way that was real and animal and not political. It was a statement that cost nothing and said a great deal. He watched the city from horseback. He watched the way people moved in it, the specific choreography of a city that had been running for a long time and had developed its own rhythms, its own logic, its own internal weather that had nothing to do with actual weather. He watched who looked at who. He watched where the looks went. He was 15, and he had been reading histories and politics for 2 years with the specific attention of someone building a model of how power actually worked rather than how it described itself working. What he saw in the city confirmed most of the model and revised several specific parts of it. Robert received them in the throne room. Jon had seen many rooms in his life. He had not seen a room designed to do this, the specific work of reminding everyone who entered it that they were small. The Iron Throne at the end of it was not a chair, he thought. It was a statement. A deliberate, ugly thing, made of swords, specifically designed to cut whoever sat in it. He stood at his mother's shoulder, and he looked at the room, and he looked at the king, who had filled out in 15 years into something enormous and ruddy. And he thought, this man killed my father. He thought it without anger. He processed the anger at 13. Through months of sitting with it and talking to his mother about it and understanding that Robert had been running on grief and love and the specific rage of a man who had never questioned whether what he wanted was what was right. He understood Robert. Understanding wasn't the same as forgiving and wasn't the same as forgetting. Robert came down from the throne. He was effusive in the way of men who are genuinely glad to see people and genuinely uncomfortable about it. He embraced Ned. He looked at Lyanna with the expression that had probably not changed in 15 years. The combination of grief and love and the specific resignation of someone who has made his peace with something and is maintaining the peace through ongoing effort. Then he looked at Jon. Jon looked back. Robert said, "This is the boy." Lyanna said, "This is Jon." Robert looked at him. Jon watched him looking. He was 15, and he had been told all his life that this moment would come, and he had thought about it and prepared for it, and now it was here. It was exactly as strange, and also as manageable as he'd expected. Robert said, "You have her eyes." Jon said, "People say so." Robert said, "You're tall for 15." Jon said, "I grew up in the north." Robert almost smiled. "Fair enough." He looked at Lyanna. He looked back at Jon. He ran the comparison that Jon had been told he would run, and he arrived somewhere, and he stepped back. He said, "Welcome to King's Landing." He meant it. He didn't know what he was welcoming. King's Landing, the court, 298 AC. The court was its own education. Jon had read about courts, the politics, the factions, the specific architecture of who stood near whom and what that meant. Reading about it and being in it were the same experience in the way that reading about swimming and drowning were the same experience. His mother moved through it. That was the first thing he noticed, the specific quality of how Lyanna Stark moved through the court of King's Landing, which was not the quality of someone comfortable in the environment and not the quality of someone uncomfortable. It was the quality of someone who had decided in advance what the environment was and was not being changed by it. He watched her talk to Cersei Lannister. That was a conversation he observed from the other side of the room, with Ghost at his heel, and a cup of wine he wasn't drinking, because he was paying attention to other things. Cersei was everything the description said. Beautiful and controlled, and carrying something underneath the control that was not warmth, and Lyanna was talking to her with the flat, northern directness that Lyanna applied to everything, and Cersei was responding with something that was closer to respect than Jon had expected. He found out later that Lyanna had known Cersei during the war. Not well. Lyanna had not been in King's Landing during the war, but through the specific network of highborn women who knew of each other and had formed assessments. What he understood from watching them was that the assessments were mutual and relatively accurate, and that neither of them was pretending anything. He spoke to Tyrion Lannister at a feast. Tyrion was not what he expected, which was probably what Tyrion intended. He was small, and he moved through the room with the specific awareness of a person who has spent a lifetime compensating for being underestimated and has turned the compensation into something more efficient than the original problem. He said when Jon sat beside him, without preamble, "You're the Stark bastard." Jon said, "That's accurate." Tyrion said, "I've been watching you watch the room for the past hour. You do it well. better than most people twice your age. Jon said, "My mother taught me." Tyrion said, "Lyanna Stark." He said the name with the specific respect of someone who has done a great deal of research. She's the most politically astute person in this room who isn't visibly exercising political influence, which is usually what real political astuteness looks like. Jon said, "You're also watching the room." Tyrion said, "I'm always watching the room. I'm very short. Watching the room is how I stay alive." He raised his cup. "Tell me about the North," Jon said. "What do you want to know?" Tyrion said, "What it's actually like. Not the songs." Jon talked about the North for an hour. He told Tyrion about the Wall, which he'd visited twice with Ned, and about the reports from the Watch that he'd been reading since he was 12 at his mother's instigation. He told him about the cold and the ranging, and the pattern of what was building beyond the Wall, with the flat northern honesty of someone who had grown up believing in it. Tyrion listened with the specific quality of attention of someone who was deciding whether to take something seriously. At the end of it, he said, "You believe it?" Jon said, "Yes." Tyrion said, "Most people from the North who say they believe it are saying so because it's the northern cultural position. You believe it because you've done the analysis." Jon said, "The analysis supports the belief." Tyrion said, "That's either impressive or alarming." Jon said, "Probably both." Tyrion studied him. He had the eyes of a man who was running several calculations simultaneously and was getting interesting results. He said, "Your mother, does she believe it?" Jon said, "She's the one who made me read the reports." Tyrion absorbed this. He looked at Lyanna across the room, who was talking to Ned and not looking at them, but probably knew exactly what they were talking about. He said, "I'll look into it." Jon said, "It would be better if you did it without announcing it." Tyrion looked at him. Jon said, "If the small council starts taking it seriously, Varys starts managing it, and by the time anything happens, it's been managed into whatever serves the current political situation, rather than what's actually true." Tyrion looked at him for a long moment. He said, "You're 15. Jon said, "Yes." Tyrion said, "That is either very impressive or extremely concerning." Jon said, "My mother says both." King's Landing. The problem. 298 AC. The problem arrived through Varys. Not Varys directly. Varys had a web, and the web had a thread, and the thread had led to a man in Pentos, who had led to a letter, and the letter had gone to a box, and the box had gone to a man whose name Lyanna recognized. The letter was about Daenerys Targaryen, who was alive, in Braavos, with her brother Viserys. Lyanna read the letter and sat with it for 4 days. She read it alone, and she thought about it alone, and she went to Ned on the 4th day and put it on the table between them. He read it. He put it down. He said, "You've known for 4 days." She said, "I needed to think before I talked about it." He said, "She's Rhaegar's sister, Jon's aunt." She said it flat, "By blood." He said, "Does Jon... He doesn't know she exists. I didn't know she was alive." She looked at the letter. Darry took her out of the country. That much I knew. I didn't know where they ended up. Ned said, "If she's in Braavos, she's safe for now. If she stays there and keeps quiet, she's safe for as long as the money holds." She looked at him. "The letter says the money is running out." He said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "I'm thinking about what Jon would think if I told him his father had a sister who was alive, and I had known and done nothing." She looked at Ned. "He'd be right to be angry." He said, "You didn't know?" She said, "I know now." He said, "Lyanna, I know what I'm proposing. I know the weight of it." She looked at the table. "But she's a child. She's 8 years old. And she's Rhaegar's blood, which is Jon's blood. And if something happens to her, what are you going to do about it? Go to Braavos. Bring her here. Not here." She looked up. "Back to Winterfell, where I can..." She stopped. "Where she'd be safe." Ned said, "The more people who know what Jon is, She's 8. She doesn't know who Jon is. She doesn't know anything except that Darry's money is running out and she and Viserys are alone in a foreign city. She held Ned's gaze. I know what it's like to be Rhaegar's secret. I've been managing one version of it for 15 years. She paused. I'm not leaving his daughter in Braavos. He said, Jon will have questions. She said, I know. He said, about Rhaegar, about who she is to him. She said, I know. She looked at the letter. It's time. He's 15. He's ready for the full truth. She paused. Or he's never going to be ready, and waiting longer doesn't improve it. Ned looked at her. He said, if she comes to Winterfell, she comes as a ward, as a girl from a good family and difficult circumstances. That's all anyone needs to know. She folded the letter. I'll go to Braavos myself, he said, alone. She said, with 3 men. I'll be there and back in a month. He said, and Viserys. She thought about this. She said, Viserys is 18. He's a man grown. He can come if he chooses. He can stay in Braavos if he chooses. She paused. But Daenerys comes home. She said it with the specific quality she had when she'd decided something. Ned knew better than to argue. Lyanna and Jon. The full truth. 298 AC. She told him everything before she went. She told him in the solar in the Tower of the Hand in the middle of the afternoon, when the castle was at its busiest, and nobody was going to interrupt them, because she'd told Ned to make sure of it. She told him about the tournament at Harrenhal, about Rhaegar's song, about the winter roses, which was a story she'd kept for last because it was the one that was most hers, the one that lived in her chest, rather than in the accessible parts of her memory. She told him about the choice. The real one. The full weight of it. What she'd known and what she'd decided and why. She told him about the Tower of Joy. He listened without speaking until she finished. Then he said, he named me Aegon. Yes. You changed it. Yes. Because Aegon was his son with Elia. Yes. She looked at him. I named you Jon, after Jon Arryn, because he gave us time, but also because it was yours. It didn't come with a claim or a legacy or a war attached to it. It was just a name, he said. But I'm the claim. She said. By blood. Yes. He sat with this. He said. He had a daughter. She said. Daenerys. Yes. She's in Braavos. He said. She's alive. She is. He looked at her. She said. I found out 4 days ago. I didn't know before. I want you to know that I didn't know before. He said. I believe you. She said, I'm going to Braavos to bring her back. She's 8 years old and alone, and she's... She paused. She's your family, Jon. By blood. The only family you have from Rhaegar. He was quiet for a moment. He said, and Viserys. She said, Viserys is difficult. He's been told his whole life that he is owed the throne. I don't know what that's made of him, and I'm going to find out. She looked at Jon. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know. Because she's coming to Winterfell, and you will meet her. And I don't want you to meet her as a stranger. He said, she doesn't know about me. No. Will you tell her? She said, not immediately. She's 8. She doesn't need the full weight of it at 8. She paused. But she'll know she has a brother. She'll know that much. He said, not nephew. She said, by blood, you're her nephew. In practice, you'll be what you are to each other, which doesn't have to match the technical word. She held his gaze. What I want is for you to have someone in the world who knows what you actually are. Someone besides me and Ned. He looked at the window. He said, you're going to Braavos? Yes. When do you leave? 3 days. He said, be careful. She said, I'm always careful. He said, you're careful. That's not the same as careful enough. She looked at him. She said, you've been listening? He said, for 15 years. Yes. She stood. She put her hand on the side of his face for a moment. The gesture she'd had since he was an infant. The one that said, I see you. I know what you are. You are mine. She held it for a moment. He held very still. She said, I'll be back in a month. He said. I know, she said. With your... She paused. With Daenerys. He said. Yes. She went to Braavos. Braavos, Lyanna and the children, 298 AC. The house was smaller than she'd expected. She'd built a picture from the letter, and the picture had been a modest house in a respectable district. And the reality was a modest house in a district that had been respectable 10 years ago and had been declining since. The paint was peeling. The garden had not been tended. She knocked. A servant answered. The last one she gathered from the inventory of the place. An old woman who had been with Darien had stayed with the children because staying was what she understood. Viserys opened the inner door. He was 18, and he had the Targaryen look. The silver hair, the pale eyes that were not quite any color available in Westeros, and he wore it with the specific studied deliberateness of someone who has been told his whole life that his appearance is political and has learned to weaponize it. He was thin. He looked at her with the expression of someone running a calculation. He said, You're Lyanna Stark. She said, Yes. He said, You're late. She said, I'm here now. He said, Darry said someone would come. He said that for years. He looked at her. No one came. She said, I know. I'm sorry for that. He said, Your brother was going to help us. That's what Darry said. She said, My brother has been managing a secret that would get your sister killed if it came out. He's been careful. Careful takes time. She held his gaze. I'm here now. I'm here with the offer to take your sister somewhere safe. He said, Just her. She said, And you, if you choose it. He looked at her. He said, Why would I go to Winterfell? She said, Because you're 18 and alone in a city where the money has run out and the connections you think you have are worth less than you think they're worth. She said it without cruelty, just observation. I'm not asking you to abandon your claim or your plans or your visions of what should happen. I'm asking you to survive long enough to act on them. He was quiet. He said, What's in Winterfell? She said, Safety, time, resources. She paused. And someone who knew your brother. He went still. She said, Someone who knew Rhaegar and who is connected to him in a way I'll explain if you come. She looked at him directly. There are things you deserve to know, Viserys. Things that have been kept from you. I intend to tell you them when the time is right. But not here. Not now. He said, You're asking me to trust you. She said, I'm asking you to get your sister and come with me to a ship. You can decide about trust on the way. A pause. He said, I'll get Daenerys. He went upstairs. Lyanna stood in the entryway of the house and breathed and looked at the peeling paint and the neglected garden and thought about the specific indignity of a dynasty's last children living in a house that was falling apart because no one had done what needed to be done until it was almost too late. She thought, not too late. She thought, barely, not too late. But not. Viserys came down with Daenerys. She was 8 years old, and she had the silver hair and the violet eyes that the Targaryen blood produced, and she held her brother's hand with the grip of a child who has learned that her brother is the only certain thing. And she looked at Lyanna with the specific open assessment of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of assessment. She said, Are you the one who's going to take us somewhere safe? Lyanna said, Yes. She said, Is it cold where we're going? Lyanna said, Very. She thought about this for a moment. She said, All right, Winterfell. The meeting, 298 AC. Jon met Daenerys in the yard. Not planned. She had arrived while he was training, and he had come out of the training session to find a small silver-haired girl standing in the Winterfell yard, looking at Ghost with the full focused attention of a child encountering something extraordinary. Ghost was looking back at her. The wolf's tail moved once. Jon stood at the training yard entrance and watched this. Daenerys reached out her hand. Ghost sniffed her wrist and then turned his head and looked at Jon. Jon walked across the yard. He crouched down to her height. She was 8. He was 15. The height difference was significant. And he looked at her. She looked back. She said, "Is this your wolf?" He said, "Yes." She said, "He likes me." He said, "Ghost likes most people." He liked me first. Before he looked at you. She was matter-of-fact about this, as if it was a point of record. What does that mean? He thought about what his mother had told him, about bloodlines and bonds, and the thing that ran in what they were. He said, "I don't know. Maybe it means you're trustworthy." She considered this. Or maybe it means he knows something. He looked at her. He said, "Maybe." She said, "My name is Daenerys." He said, "I know." She said, "My brother told me your name is Jon." "Yes," she said. "He said your mother is the woman who brought us here." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. She had the violet eyes that were his father's family's mark, and that he'd read about in the histories, and that were confronted in a real face. Something else than he'd expected. Not intimidating or strange, but very direct. The eyes of a person who was looking at you specifically, and not at the category you belong to. She said, "Are we related?" He went still. She said, "I'm asking because your wolf liked me, and because your mother looked at me the way people look at things that are familiar." He was 15 and she was 8, and she was asking him the question his mother hadn't told him how to answer yet. He said, "I don't know what your brother has told you about your family." She said, "Everything. He tells me everything. Sometimes more than once." He said, "Then you know about Rhaegar." Something crossed her face. The name landed in a specific way. She said, "He was my brother." "Yes." "He died at the Trident." "Yes." She looked at him. He said, "My mother knows things about him. She'll tell you when you're ready. Not now." He held her gaze. "But yes. We're related." She thought about this with the focused seriousness of a child doing real thinking. She said, "How?" He said, "I'll let my mother explain it properly." She said, "Are you going to be my friend?" He said, "I'll try." She said, "Ghost already is." He looked at the wolf. Ghost's tail moved again. He said, "I think that's a good sign." She said, "I think so too." Winter fell. Viserys, the difficult one. Viserys was harder, not impossible. Lyanna had expected impossible and was managing difficult, which was its own adjustment. He was 18, and he had been told his whole conscious life that he was the last king of a stolen dynasty, and the world owed him a restoration. And this formation had produced a young man of considerable intelligence and considerable grievance who was at war with himself about whether the grievance was useful or just painful. He arrived at Winterfell and he assessed it with the eyes of someone who had been raised on Dragonstone and had grown up hearing about Dragonstone as the standard against which things were measured. Winterfell was not Dragonstone. Winterfell was northern and grey and old in the specifically unapologetic way of places that have been somewhere for a very long time and have never tried to be anywhere else. He trained. Not immediately. Not the first day or the week after. But when Robb was in the yard one morning doing forms that were clearly competent and Viserys watched from the edge with the look of someone who understood what they were watching and had opinions about it, Jon suggested he join. He expected resistance. Viserys said, "Your grip on the right hand is too tight. You lose speed." Robb turned, looked at him. Viserys walked into the yard, picked up a practice sword, and demonstrated. His form was different from the northern style, not better or worse, different, the specific style that Sir Willem Darry had taught him in a house in Bravos, which was the Kingsguard style, trained by a man who had been one of the best fighters in the realm. Robb watched. Then he said, "Show me again." They trained for 3 hours. By the end of the 3 hours, something had shifted between them. Not friendship, not yet, but the specific rapport that forms between people who have found each other capable. Jon watched from the fence. He watched Viserys with the same attentiveness. He watched everything, building the model of the person, understanding what the grievance was and what was underneath the grievance. What he saw was someone who had been told he was important and had never been allowed to be competent. The importance had been thrust on him. The competence had to be earned. He went to Viserys that evening. He said, "Your father is a complicated subject." Viserys looked at him. Jon said, "I know more about him than you might expect." "My mother." He paused. "My mother knew him. In a way that makes it complicated." He watched Viserys absorb this. Viserys said, "Rhaegar." Jon said, "Yes." Viserys said, "How did she?" Jon said, "It's a long story and it's not mine to tell. But I know it." He held his gaze. "And what I know is that he was more than the histories make him. More complicated. He believed something about the world, about what was coming, and the belief made him do things that cost everyone." Viserys said, "He took your mother." Jon said, "No." Viserys went still. Jon said, "She made a choice. The world won't say that, and I understand why, and it's still true." He looked at Viserys steadily. "Your brother was a man who made choices. Not all of them were right. Some of them were. The choice about my mother was..." He stopped. "Was what it was. I'm not here to judge it." He paused. "I'm here because she thinks you should know there's someone in this castle who has an honest account of him." Viserys looked at him. He said very carefully, "How are you related to him?" Jon said, "That's my mother's story to tell." "She'll tell you." "I promise she will." Viserys looked at him for a long time. He said, "You're not going to give me an easy answer." Jon said, "I don't have any easy answers." He said, "That's extremely frustrating." Jon said, "I know." He said, "You're 15." Jon said, "Yes." He said, "You talk like someone much older." Jon said, "My mother." Viserys absorbed this. He looked at the yard where he'd been training with Robb. He looked at the castle around him, the grey stone and the hot spring warmth that made it different from the cold outside. He said, "I'm going to want the full story." Jon said, "You'll get it." He said, "When?" Jon said, "When my mother decides it's time." He looked at him. "Soon. I think soon." Viserys nodded. Once. The nod of a man who has agreed to wait but is filing the waiting as a cost to be accounted for later. Jon went back inside. He thought, the grievance is real. The anger behind the grievance is real. The person behind the anger might actually be worth something, if the anger can find an object that's worth pointing at. He thought, the Night's Watch reports were worth pointing at. He thought, that's for later. King's Landing. What broke? 298 AC. The thing that broke was not one thing. It was the accumulation of things, which was how things usually broke. Ned at the small council. Ned reading the documents. Ned following the thread of Jon Arryn's investigation to its conclusion, and finding in the conclusion something that made everything more dangerous. Joffrey's parentage. The succession question. The specific rot at the center of the realm's foundation. He sent a raven north. The raven said, "Come back, all of you, now." Lyanna read the raven. She showed it to Jon. He said, "What happened?" She said, "I don't know the specifics. I know the tone." She looked at the raven. Something he found. Jon said, "The succession." She looked at him. He said, "I've been watching. Ned has been. His face is different when he's at the small council than when he's anywhere else. Something at the small council is worrying him." He paused. "The children. Joffrey and the others." She said, "How do you know about..." He said, "Tyrion, not directly. Tyrion thinks loudly when he's drinking and I've been listening." He held her gaze. "If Joffrey isn't Robert's, then the succession is a question. And the answer to that question makes Robert's reign unstable. And instability makes this court very dangerous for everyone." She looked at the raven. "We need to go home," Jon said. "All of us," she said. "All of us," he said. "Daenerys and Viserys," she said. "Yes." She folded the raven. "Pack what matters. We leave at dawn," he said. "They won't go easily." Viserys. Viserys will go because I'll tell him the full truth before we leave, and the full truth will make the choice clear. She looked at Jon. Help Daenerys, he said. She'll be frightened. She's been frightened before. She'll manage. She met his eyes. So will you. He said, I'm not frightened. She said, you should be. A little. He said, right. A little. She said, go. Now. He went. The road north, 298 a few. They rode out of King's Landing before the gates were fully open. 7 people. Lyanna, Jon, Daenerys, Viserys, and 3 men who were Neds and who had been told what they needed to know and nothing more. Ghost ran alongside the horses in the grey morning. Viserys had been told. Lyanna had told him in the hour before dawn, standing in the chamber in the Tower of the Hand with the candle burning low, and the city outside beginning its morning noise. She had told him all of it. The winter roses, and the choice, and the Tower of Joy, and what Rhaegar had called his son before he rode to the Trident. She had told him, Jon is Rhaegar's son. He is your brother's son. He has a better claim than you by any strict succession. That is the truth you've been living without. Viserys had stood very still for a long time. He had said, Jon Snow. She had said, yes. He had said, he knew. She had said, since he was 13. He had said, and he didn't. She had said, he is not the kind of person who collects advantages. He is the kind of person who does what needs doing. She had looked at him. So are you, if you let yourself be. He had looked at his hands. He had said, my brother had a son. She had said, yes. He had said, he left me a nephew. She had said, he left you someone worth knowing. What you do with that is your choice. Now on the road north, Viserys rode beside Jon, and they did not speak for the first 2 hours. Not awkward silence. The silence of 2 people who have been given something large and are carrying it carefully. Eventually Viserys said, I should hate you. Jon said, I know. Viserys said, you have the claim I was told my whole life was mine. Jon said, I know. Viserys said, I don't hate you. Jon said, I know. Viserys said, that's annoying. Jon said, yes, I imagine it is. Viserys was quiet for a moment. He said, he would have been proud of you. Jon looked at him. Viserys said, Rhaegar, he believed in the prophecy. He believed the world was going to need someone. And you. He paused. You are very much what he was trying to build. He said it with the specific, complicated feeling of someone who is being honest about something that costs them. That's both a compliment and irritating, Jon said. I'll take both. Viserys said, you would. He looked ahead at the road. When this is done, when whatever is about to happen in King's Landing is done and we've gotten through it, I want to discuss the wall, Jon said. The Night's Watch reports. Viserys said, yes. I've been reading them since you mentioned them. I understand why you've been concerned. He paused. The Targaryens are fire. If there is something that is ice, in the way the old accounts suggest, Jon said, then both of us matter for it. Viserys said, in different ways. Jon said, in different ways. Viserys nodded. He rode. Behind them, Daenerys was beside Lyanna, on the smaller horse, talking with the ease of a child who had found in this woman something that answered a need she hadn't known she had. Lyanna was answering her questions about the North with the specific directness she brought to children's questions, not simplifying and not overwhelming. Jon looked back at them. He thought about the Tower of Joy and the choice his mother had made, and the chain of consequences that had produced this road on this morning. His mother alive, Rhaegar's daughter beside her, his uncle somewhere behind them trying to hold a court together that was coming apart. He thought, it's not clean. It's never clean. He thought, we figure it out. Ghost ran ahead. They rode north. Winterfell, home, 298 AC. Winterfell in autumn was the best version of it. The harvest was in. The cold was close enough to taste, but hadn't committed yet. The castle had the specific living quality it had in the seasons between winter and not winter, when the preparations were ongoing and the household was fully occupied and everything was purposeful. Lyanna rode through the gates and felt the specific relief of arriving somewhere that was entirely hers. Not Ned's, his technically by name and title, but hers in the deeper sense. She had grown up here. She had come back here. She had built her life here, and built her son here, and built everything she was going to build here. She got off her horse. Catelyn was at the steps. They looked at each other. Catelyn had read Ned's Raven, and she had read it with the care of a woman who had spent 15 years learning to read what was not said as well as what was. She had prepared the household for an arrival that she didn't entirely understand, and she had done it with the efficiency she brought to everything. She looked at Lyanna. She looked at Daenerys. She looked at Viserys. She said quietly to Lyanna, "I trust this is necessary." Lyanna said, "Everything I've ever done has been necessary. Not always wise." Catelyn looked at her. Something passing between them. The 15 years of it. The specific, complicated accommodation they had made. The shared understanding that neither of them had asked for their situation, and both of them had managed it as well as it could be managed. She said, "Come inside. It's cold." She went in. Lyanna followed. Robb came down the stairs. He looked at Jon. He looked at the silver-haired girl beside him. He said, "Who's she?" Jon said, "She's Daenerys. She's going to be living here for a while." Robb said, "Why?" Jon said, "It's a long story." Robb said, "You always say that." Jon said, "The stories keep getting longer." Robb said to Daenerys, "I'm Robb." Daenerys said, "I know. Jon's told me about you." Robb said, "What did he say?" She said, "That you're louder than he is, but not as loud as you seem." Robb looked at Jon. Jon said, "I said something like that." Robb said, "I like her." He clapped Jon on the shoulder. "Come inside. Arya's been waiting to throw things at you since you left." He went in. Jon looked at Daenerys. She was looking at the castle, at the grey stone towers, and the hot spring warmth rising through the flags in the yard, at the direwolves somewhere in the kennels who could be heard through the walls, at the sky above Winterfell that was the specific northern sky that wasn't softer than other skies, but was more honest. She said, "It's very cold." He said, "Yes." She said, "You said very." He said, "I wasn't understating." She said, "I like it." She said it with the surprise of someone discovering a preference they hadn't anticipated. "It feels real," he said. "The North usually does." She looked at him. She said, "Jon." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you for what your mother did." She paused. "And what you did, even though you didn't do anything specific. What you both..." She stopped. She was 8, and she was searching for the adult word for a thing she was feeling. "You came and you got us." He said, "Yes." She said, "No one had before." He said, "I know." She said, "Why did she?" He thought about this. He said, "Because you're family. And in the North, family is what you don't leave." She thought about this. She said, "I'm going to like it here." He said, "Yes, I think you will." He walked her inside. Winter fell. What was built? 298 to 300 AC. The next 2 years were the building years. Not building as in construction. Building as in the thing that happens when the right people are in the same place for long enough and begin to find out what they can make together. Ned came back from King's Landing. He came back changed in the specific way of men who have seen the rot at the center of something they believed in. He came back knowing about Joffrey and the succession and the specific dangerous fragility of a realm built on lies. He came back and he told Lyanna, and she sat with it, and she said, "It's going to come apart." He said, "Not yet." She said, "Soon." He said, "Possibly." She said, "Ned, It's going to come apart. And when it does, the question of what fills the space is going to matter more than anything else. She looked at him. We need to be ready, he said. Jon. She said. Jon. And Daenerys. And Viserys. In whatever role he can hold himself to. She looked out the window at the yard where her son was training with Robb and Viserys in a configuration that had taken 6 months to reach and that worked. We build toward it. Not the throne. The readiness for when the throne becomes a question. He said, You've been planning this for years. She said, I've been planning this since before he was born. She looked at Ned. I chose this. I chose Rhaegar, and I chose the consequence, and I chose to keep the consequence alive, and bring him here, and raise him, to be someone worth the raising. She looked at the yard. Now I plan for what that becomes. He sat beside her. He said, What does it become? She said, I don't know yet, but I'm going to have a hand in it. She did. In the yard, Jon trained. He trained with Robb and Viserys in the configuration that had evolved, the three of them finding in each other the specific combination that no one of them had alone. Robb's command instinct, Viserys' technique, the Kingsguard style that Darry had taught him. Jon's everything else, the speed and the reading and the specific quality of combat intelligence that his mother had built into him since he was old enough to stand in a yard. Ghost was always there. Daenerys watched. She had been watching the training yard since her 2nd month at Winterfell, from the fence, in the specific way that Lyanna had described watching and that Jon had learned from Lyanna. She was 10 and then 11, and she watched with the focused attention of someone building a model of something. Jon found her there one afternoon and said, You want to learn? She said, Yes. He said, Why? She said, Because I need to know how to do things myself. Not just understand them, he said. Arya. I know Arya trains. I want to train differently. She looked at him. I want to know what you know, he said. What I know is mostly what my mother taught me, she said. Then teach me what your mother taught you. He thought about this. He said, She'll want to teach you herself. Daenerys said, I know, but I'm asking you, he said. Because, she said, because you learned it and made it yours. She teaches the original. I want to learn from someone who's already done that. She looked at him steadily. You're faster than your mother. She's more precise. You took her precision and added speed. I want to learn that. He looked at her. He said, You've been watching this for months. She said, Yes. He said, How long have you been planning to ask? She said, 3 weeks. I wanted to understand it first before I asked. He said, That's very Targaryen. She said, I've heard that about myself. He said, All right, tomorrow, before the morning session. She nodded. She was there before dawn. He taught her. Lyanna and Daenerys, the gods would. 299 AC. Lyanna told Daenerys the full truth when she was 11. Not the full truth. Not Jon's claim and the succession implications and the weight of what the blood meant politically. But Rhaegar, the real Rhaegar. Not the story Viserys told, which was true in broad strokes and simplified in ways that made him smaller than he was. She told her in the Gods Wood on an autumn afternoon when the leaves were doing what northern leaves did, which was change colour suddenly and completely and without apology. She sat beside the pool. Daenerys sat beside her. Lyanna said, I'm going to tell you about your brother. Daenerys said, I've heard about him. Lyanna said, You've heard Viserys' version. I'm going to tell you mine. Daenerys looked at her. Lyanna said, I chose to be with him. I want you to understand that completely before I tell you anything else. Not taken, not forced. I looked at what was in front of me and I decided. That is who I am, and it is how I make decisions, and I have never regretted being that person. Daenerys said, I know. Lyanna looked at her. She said, I've known since I got here. That you chose. She paused. Viserys says one thing. Your face says another. I've been watching your face for 3 years. Lyanna said, You're 11. Daenerys said, You taught Jon to watch faces. Jon taught me. Lyanna looked at the pool. She said, He was... She stopped. She was choosing carefully. He was someone who believed in something so completely that the believing made him larger than he actually was. He thought the world was going to end, and he thought he could stop it, and he organized his life around that belief in ways that cost everyone around him. She said, The long night. Lyanna said, The prophecy, yes, the prince that was promised. He believed it was real. She paused. I think it might be real. I've been reading the Night's Watch reports for 15 years. Something is building beyond the wall. She looked at Daenerys. Your brother believed fire was the answer to it. He believed his blood, his children, were the fire. Daenerys was very still. Lyanna said, He loved Elia. What he did to her and to their marriage was wrong, and it cost her everything, and that wrong is real, and I will not pretend it away. She held Daenerys' gaze. He also loved me. Both of those things are true. People are capable of genuine love and genuine wrong simultaneously. That's not a comfortable truth, but it's a true one. Daenerys said, Jon. Lyanna said, Yes. She said, He's the prince. She said, By blood, by the prophecy, by Rhaegar's belief. She paused. Jon doesn't believe in prophecy. He believes in the problem. He believes something is coming and the right people need to be ready for it. Daenerys looked at the pool. She said, And me. Lyanna said, You are Rhaegar's daughter, by the same blood, the same fire. She paused. What that means for you, what role you'll have, is not something I can tell you. It's something you'll find. Daenerys said, How? Lyanna said, By being here, by learning, by being in a place that teaches you who you are and what you can do. She looked at her. The North teaches. It's not a kind teacher, but it's an honest one. Daenerys looked around the Godswood, at the trees and the pool and the face in the heart tree that she'd been sitting beside for 3 years. She said, I like it here. Lyanna said, I know. She said, I didn't think I would. It's very cold. Lyanna said, The cold teaches too. Daenerys sat for a moment. She said, Jon is my nephew. Lyanna said, Yes. She said, But he feels like a brother. Lyanna said, Yes. She said, Is that all right? Lyanna looked at her. She said, The blood is the blood. What you are to each other in practice is yours to decide. She paused. The blood said he was my son and a Targaryen. The practice said he was a Stark child in a northern castle. Both of those things are true. He's both. Daenerys looked at the pool. She said, I want to help. When it comes. The thing beyond the wall. Lyanna said, I know. She said, The fire. If it's real, if that's what we are. Lyanna said, Then we use it for the right thing. She held her gaze. That's the whole point. The whole thing my brother believed in, and lived by, and died for. Use the fire for the right thing. She paused. Don't let the fire be the end of you. Daenerys said, Is that what happened to your father? My father? Lyanna said. Yes. Daenerys said, I don't want that. Lyanna said, I know you don't. She put her hand briefly on Daenerys's. That's why I'm telling you, so you know the shape of the thing you're trying not to become. Daenerys looked at the heart tree. She said, Thank you. Lyanna said, Don't thank me yet. Daenerys said, Why not yet? Lyanna said, Because the hard part hasn't happened yet. She stood. Thank me after. The wall, the first ranging, 300 AC. The watch sent a raven that was different from the other ravens. Not in content. The content was the same accumulation of reports they'd been receiving for years, the cold front and the missing rangers, and the pattern. Different in tone. The Lord Commander's tone had changed from the professional urgency of a man reporting things he believed were important to the specific, tight tone of a man who had stopped reporting what he believed was important and had started reporting what was happening. Jon read it. He brought it to Lyanna. She read it. She said, "It's time." He said, "Yes." She said, "You're going north." He said, "We're going north." She looked at him. He said, "You're not staying at Winterfell while I go to the Wall." She said, "Jon," he said, "you've been preparing for this my entire life. You're the one who made me read the reports. You're the one who convinced Ned to take it seriously. You're the one who trained me for exactly this moment." He held her gaze. "You don't prepare someone for something and then watch from the castle." She looked at him. She said, "I'm not a fighter anymore." He said, "You're the person who knows more about what's coming than anyone alive." He paused. "You've been reading the accounts since before I was born. The long night histories, the prophecy records, everything. Who else do you think should be at the Wall?" She was quiet. He said, "Daenerys comes." She said, "She's 12. He said, "She's been training for a year. She's been reading the accounts alongside me for 6 months." He held her gaze. "She is Rhaegar's daughter. If the fire matters, if what the prophecy says is true, she needs to be there." Lyanna said, "Viserys." Jon said, "Viserys wants to come. He's been preparing for it since I told him about the reports." He paused. He's going to be useful." Lyanna looked at him. She looked at the Raven. She said, "Robb." Jon said, "Robb stays. The North needs someone at Winterfell who can lead it." He paused. "He's the Lord of Winterfell when Ned is gone. He stays." She said, "Catelyn," he said, "stays with Robb, as it should be." She looked at the Raven for a long time. She said, "You've been planning this." He said, "You taught me to plan." She said, "I taught you to read the situation and respond, not to plan ahead of me." He said, "I watched you do it for 15 years, and then I started doing it myself." She almost smiled. She said, "You're going to be insufferable when you're older?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Like your father." He looked at her. She said, "He planned everything. He believed the whole world was a calculation he could manage if he just went far enough ahead." She paused. "He was wrong about some of it, right about the important parts." Jon said, "I know," she said. "Don't be so certain about the calculation that you miss what's actually there." He said, "I'll try." She said, "Right. We go north, all of us." She stood. "I'm going to need a word with Mormont before we arrive." He said, "I've been corresponding with him for a year." She looked at him. He said, "You looked surprised." She said, "I'm not surprised. I'm recalibrating." She looked at him steadily. "How long have you been making decisions I don't know about?" He said, "Since I was about 14. She said, "We're going to have a conversation about that." He said, "On the road north." She said, "Yes." She went to tell Ned. The Wall, 300 AC. Lyanna saw the Wall for the first time when she was 17. She saw it again now at 34, and it was not the same thing it had been. She had grown up knowing the Wall the way Northerners knew things, in the back of the mind, as a fact of the world, present and enormous, and not examined too closely. Standing at its base was different. The Wall was a teacher, Ned had always said, and she understood now what he meant. It communicated something through the ground and through the cold, and through the simple fact of its scale. This was built by people who believed something was coming. This was the shape of what belief looked like when you made it physical. Mormont met them at the gate. He looked at Jon. He said, "You're taller than your letters." Jon said, "People say that." Mormont said, "You must be Lady Stark." Lyanna said, "Lyanna," he said, "you've been sending ravens I didn't receive." She said, "The ones that went through Ned," he said. "The ones that went around everyone and arrived at my desk directly." She looked at Jon. Jon said, "I was thorough." Mormont looked between them with the expression of a man who has been at this wall for 20 years and has encountered many things, but not quite this. He said, "Come inside, all of you." He showed them everything. The maps, the records, the accounts that had been building for 30 years into the picture that nobody in the South would look at directly. Lyanna read it with the attention of someone who had been reading it in pieces and was now seeing the whole. Jon read alongside her. Daenerys read it with the expression she always had when she encountered information that connected to something she'd been understanding since before she could articulate understanding it. The recognition of something known from inside finding its external confirmation. Viserys read it with the focused urgency of someone who had decided this was his cause and was now meeting the evidence of why. Mormont watched them all read. He said, when they finished, "You believe it." Lyanna said, "I've believed it for 20 years. I came because believing it wasn't enough." He said, "What do you need?" She said, "Tell me where the Night King is." He went still. He said, "We don't know exactly." She said, "Tell me what you know." He told them, the night before, Lyanna and Jon. She found him on the battlements. Of course she did. He had her habit of going high when he needed to think, going up until the world spread out and the immediate problems became the sizes they actually were, rather than the sizes proximity made them. She stood beside him. The north below the wall was the north, dark and cold and enormous and honest. She said, "Tomorrow." He said, "Yes." She said, "Arranging, what Mormont described." He said, "Yes." She said, "It's not going to be clean." He said, "No." She said, "I want you to hear me say something." He looked at her. She said, "Whatever happens, whatever the outcome of this is, you were worth every cost, every year, every lie, everything I gave up or managed or carried." She said it with the flat, northern directness that was her primary mode. "You are what I chose with my whole self, and the whole self-choice was right. I've been right about few things in my life with that certainty." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I know." She said, "I'm telling you in case you forget." He said, "I don't forget." She said, "You might be busy forgetting when it matters." He said, "I won't." She said, "Your father believed the world needed someone. He shaped his whole life around the believing." She looked at the north. He didn't know the person he believed the world needed was going to grow up in Winterfell being trained by me in the yard. She paused. "He had good instincts, but a limited imagination," Jon said. "Was he wrong about the world needing someone?" She said, "No." She looked at him. "He was wrong about the frame, the prophecy and the destiny and the chosen one. That's the wrong frame." She paused. "The right frame is. The world has a problem. A person or persons with specific qualities and specific preparation can address it. That person or persons can be built and shaped and trained and prepared." She held his gaze. "That's what I've been doing," he said. "Building me." She said, "Building you." And watching Daenerys build herself with the tools she had. She looked at the dark north, and trusting that Viserys has something worth trusting underneath the grievance. He said, "You trust him?" She said, "I trust that he loved his brother, and his brother's belief was real, and he has been carrying that belief for 18 years without the resources to do anything with it." She paused. "Now he has resources." Jon said, "You gave him the resources." She said, "We all did." She looked at him. "That's the part your father missed. He thought it was one person, one prophecy, one answer." She shook her head. "It's people. It's always people, working together, filling in each other's gaps." Jon looked at the north. He said, "Tomorrow we fill in the gaps." She said, "Yes." He said, "With Daenerys and Viserys and Mormont and the Watch." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you?" She said, "And me." He looked at her. He said, "I love you." She looked at him. He said, "I don't say it enough. You say the important things directly, and I've watched you do it my whole life. and I still hold the important things back until the last moment. She said, "You're 17. He said, "You're 34. You waited until the battlements before the battle to say what you said." She looked at him. She said, "Fair." She put her arm around his shoulder, and he leaned into it the way he'd been leaning into it since he was small enough to fit under her arm entirely. They looked at the north together, the dark and the cold and the enormous honesty of it. She said, "We go in together." He said, "We come back together." She said, "Yes." Beyond the wall, the thing itself. They went north with 40 men, and the information Mormont's rangers had assembled, and the knowledge that the information was incomplete. The dead were north of the wall, but the army of the dead was not yet at the wall, which was the window between building toward the wall and at the wall, and the window was what they had. Jon led, not because anyone assigned him the lead, because he walked at the front and the men fell in behind him, and Mormont beside him did not challenge this, which was Mormont's way of confirming it. Lyanna was at his right. She was not a fighter the way she'd been at 17. 34 years and 15 years of Winterfell rather than a yard had changed what her body could do. What she was now was something else. She was the person who had been reading the accounts since before Jon was born and who understood the tactical picture more completely than anyone except possibly Jon himself. She walked at his right and she told him what she saw. He listened and he moved. Daenerys was behind them. She was 12 and she had been training for a year, and she was not going to be in the front of this engagement, but she was here, and she was present in the specific way she was always present, the full attention of someone who has decided to be entirely where they are. Ghost ranged ahead. The wolf moved through the terrain of beyond the wall with the ease of something that belonged here, that was of this place in a way the humans weren't, that could read the landscape in ways the humans had to approximate, with tools and training and experience. He stopped, 40 feet ahead. He turned. He looked at Jon. Jon stopped. He raised his hand. The column stopped. He looked at the tree line. The dead were in the tree line. Not many. Not the army. A patrol, maybe. A forward element. The specific cold that was not weather coming off them in the directional way of something organized by something else. Lyanna, quietly, dragon glass, now. The men who had it ready had it out. Jon drew Longclaw. The dead came out of the tree line. What followed was not clean, but it was shorter than he'd expected. The dragon glass worked the way every report said it worked. Completely, immediately, without remainder. The dead stopped when the stone found them, and they stopped absolutely. And the men who had been afraid of exactly this, who had heard the reports and believed them and been afraid of the gap between believing and encountering, discovered in the encounter that the gap was manageable. Manageable was not nothing. Manageable was everything. When the patrol was gone, when the cold had retreated and the field was still, and the men were standing in the aftermath of the first contact, Jon looked north. The Night King wasn't here, but it had been here. Something had been directing these dead, and something had withdrawn when the engagement went wrong for it, and whatever that was north of here, and looking at what had just happened. Jon looked north. Lyanna was beside him. She said quietly, "For him only." "It knows we're here." He said, "Yes." She said, "It's going to have to decide." He said, "What?" She said, "Whether to come to us or wait for us to come to it." She looked at the north. "It's been waiting for 8,000 years. It's patient." He said, "We don't have 8,000 years," she said. "No, we have." She looked at the sky. "We have the window, before the army reaches the wall," he said. "Then we go north," she said. "Yes." He looked at the men behind him. At Mormont, at Daenerys, who was watching the north with the expression of someone who was feeling something she didn't have a name for yet. He said, loud enough for the column, "We go north." He went north. The Night King, 300 AC. They found him in the deep north, in a valley the maps had a name for that nobody had used in 8,000 years. Not alone. He was never alone. The dead were around him in the way of things that serve a purpose. But the army was behind him, south of here. And this was the source. The source looked at them. Jon looked back. He had thought about this moment for years. Not the Night King specifically. He hadn't known what the Night King looked like. The descriptions were inadequate. But the moment of confrontation, the moment when the thing that was coming finally stopped coming and was here. He had prepared for it the way you prepared for something that didn't have a dress rehearsal, by understanding everything you could and accepting the understanding was incomplete. The Night King raised its hand. Dead rose from the ground. Jon moved. He moved the way his mother had taught him to move. Not toward the immediate threat. Toward where the immediate threat was going to be in 3 seconds. The committed attack that accounted for the target's direction rather than its position. Longclaw found the Night King. What happened was what the accounts described, and what no description had prepared him for. The stopping. The absolute complete stopping of something that had been moving for 8,000 years. The silence of it. The specific cold retreating. The dead stopped. All of them. The patrol in the valley and the army south of them, in the mass stopping of things that had been directed and were now not. Jon stood in the valley. Lyanna was beside him. She was breathing hard, and there was a cut on her arm from a dead thing that had gotten closer than it should have, and she was looking at the still field with an expression he had never seen on her before. He said, "Are you?" "I'm fine." She looked at the cut. "It's nothing." She looked at the valley, at the still things, at the specific quality of the cold that was already retreating, already becoming just cold, just northern cold, just the world as it actually was. She said, "Jon." He said, "Yes." She said, "You did it." He said, "We did it." She said, "Don't." He said, "I know what you're going to say. And yes, I did the specific thing at the end. But the specific thing at the end was possible because of everything before it, and everything before it was this." He gestured at the people around them, at Mormont and the Rangers and Viserys at the flank, and Daenerys behind him, and the 40 men who had come north and who were all still standing. It was all of it. She looked at him. He said, "You built that. Everything before it, you built it." She said, "You let yourself be built." He said, "You made it easy." She looked at the valley. She said, "Is it over?" He looked at the night sky, at the cold that was just cold. He said, "The Night King is over. The dead are stopped." He paused. The watch is still there. The wall is still there. Whatever came after the Night King in the old accounts, the rebuilding, the maintenance. She said, "That's years of work." He said, "Yes." She said, "I know." She looked at the still valley. "But the thing we came here to do." He said, "Yes." She exhaled. She said, "Then let's go home." Home, what came after. They went home. Not immediately. The work of the aftermath was its own campaign. The documentation of the engagement and the bodies and the communication south to Ned and to the Lords and the management of what the Night's Watch was going to be now that the thing it had been built to hold was gone. But they went home. Lyanna rode back to Winterfell in late autumn with her son on one side and Rhaegar's daughter on the other and Viserys behind them, and she felt the specific relief of the thing being done. Not finished. The question of the realm wasn't finished. The question of Jon and Daenerys and what their blood meant for the world south of the wall was not finished. But the specific immediate thing, the thing she had been pointing every decision toward for 17 years, was done. They came through Winterfell's gates. Robb was there. He looked at Jon for a long time. Jon looked at him. Robb said, "Did you?" Jon said, "Yes." Robb said, "Is it?" Jon said, "The Night King is gone. The dead stopped. The wall holds." He paused. "It's not everything. There's still work." Robb said, "But the main thing." Jon said, The main thing, yes. Rob looked at his brother, his cousin, technically, but the word had never fit the relationship. For a moment. Then he said, Mum's going to talk to you for about 3 hours. Jon said, I know. Rob said, Catelyn's going to want to know everything. Jon said, I know. Rob said, Arya's going to be furious she wasn't there. Jon said, I expected no less. Rob said, Welcome home. He clapped him on the shoulder and went to get Daenerys, who was still on her horse, with the expression of someone who had arrived at a place and was processing what it felt like to arrive. Rob said, You all right? Daenerys said, Yes. She looked at Winterfell. It feels different. He said, You went to the wall and back. Things feel different after. She said, Is that always true? He said, In my experience, yes. She said, What do you do with it? He said, Come inside, eat something, sleep in an actual bed. He held out his hand. Then figure out the rest in the morning. She took his hand and got down from the horse. She walked inside. Jon watched her go. Lyanna appeared beside him. She said, She's going to be something. He said, She already is. She said, More than this. She looked at Winterfell. The South is still a question. The throne is still a question. Joffrey is still... He said, Mum. She said, What? He said, One thing at a time. She looked at him. He said, You taught me that. One thing at a time, and then the next thing, and then the next. The immediate thing is done. The next thing is rest. He looked at her. Rest first. Then we figure out the rest. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, When did you get wise? He said, I learned from someone who plans everything 3 steps ahead. It's occasionally useful to take 1 step at a time instead. She almost smiled. She said, 1 step at a time. He said, Yes. She said, Fine. She walked toward the castle, over her shoulder. But we're talking about the South tomorrow. He said, I know. She said, And Daenerys' role. He said, I know. She said, And Viserys. He said, I know. She said, And Jon. He said, Mum. She stopped. He said, Tomorrow. She looked at him. She said, Tomorrow. She went inside. He stood in the yard for a moment. Ghost was there. Always there. The wolf sat beside him and looked at the castle. Jon looked at Winterfell. He looked at the walls that had held him since before he could walk, and the towers that had been there for centuries before him, and would be there for centuries after, and the hot spring warmth that came up through the flags even in the cold. He thought about his mother at 17 in the Tower of Joy choosing to live. He thought about everything that choice had built. He thought, it was worth it. He put his hand on Ghost's head. The wolf's tail moved. They went inside. What if Lyanna Stark survived and raised Jon herself? She raised him like she did everything, with the flat, northern honesty that was her primary mode, and the specific, absolute love of someone who chose something with their whole self and was not going to pretend otherwise. She raised him to understand what he was before the world tried to tell him. She raised him to carry the bastard name correctly. Like a sword, she said. Know it's there. Know what it can do. You decide when it matters. She raised him to read the reports nobody else was reading, and to take seriously the things people found inconvenient to take seriously, and to go north when north was where the work was. She went north with him. She came back with him. She spent 17 years managing the weight of what she'd chosen, and she did it without regret, and she did it without performing the absence of regret, which is harder than either alternative. The secret was a voice now. Her voice, specifically. The secret had always been hers. She had chosen it, carried it, protected it. Having it be voiced, rather than silent, changed the shape of what it had to do. Jon grew up knowing he was loved. Not uncomplicated love. Nothing about it was uncomplicated. But the whole self kind. The kind that doesn't flinch from the truth of what it chose. The world needed someone. Rhaegar believed that, and organized his whole life around it. Lyanna believed it too, in her own way. in the northern way that didn't dress things up. She built the someone herself. Then she went north beside him and helped him be it. That's not a destiny. That's a mother. Lyanna. The Godswood. The morning after. She went to the Godswood before anyone else was awake. This was her habit, had been her habit since before the war, since before Jon, since she was a girl in this castle who needed somewhere to go, where nobody required anything of her. The Godswood was that place. The old gods asked nothing. They watched. Lyanna had always found the watching sufficient. She sat by the pool. The pool reflected the heart tree and the dark sky beginning to lighten. She thought about the Tower of Joy. She thought about it rarely now. In the early years, she had thought about it constantly. The fever and the maester and the choice to live, which had felt in the worst moments like an imposition, and in the best moments like exactly the right thing. In the middle years, she had thought about it when the weight of it was close to the surface. In the recent years, she thought about it when something happened that required calibration against the beginning. Last night required calibration. She had stood in a valley beyond the wall and watched her son kill the thing that had been threatening the world since before there was a world to threaten. And she had thought, this is what everything was for. This specific moment. This is the end of the chain. Then she had thought, it's not the end. It's a turning point. The chain continues. She thought about that now. The chain was Jon, who was 17 and had done the thing, and who was going to have to live the rest of his life as the person who had done it. That was its own weight. She knew that weight. She had lived for 17 years as the person who had chosen Rhaegar, the person the world had decided was a story, and the story had cost her things she couldn't have inventoried at the time, and had inventoried since. Jon was going to have a story too. He already had one. It was going to get larger. She thought about Daenerys, who was 12, and who had stood behind her in the valley, and who had watched with those eyes that saw too much, and who had not been frightened. Not once. She had been serious and present and not frightened. And Lyanna had made a note of that, because not being frightened at 12 in the face of the dead was either extremely worrying or extremely meaningful. And she had looked at the girl's face and decided it was the second. She thought about Viserys. She had underestimated him. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge this. She had expected the grievance to be the dominant note, and it had been, initially. And then something had shifted. The wall had done it. Standing at the base of the wall, and then at the top, and then going north of it, the wall had done to Viserys what it did to everyone it worked on, which was to make the things that mattered in the south matter less, and the things that actually mattered matter more. He had fought well last night. He had fought with the Kingsguard technique that Darry had given him, and with the specific, focused violence of someone who had found the right thing to be angry at. She had watched him work through a forward element of the dead with the efficiency of a man who understood what he was doing and why. She had thought, Rhaegar would be proud. She had also thought, Rhaegar would have taken credit for it somehow. That was the problem with people who built their whole lives around being right about something. When they were right, they wanted the being right to be about them. This was not about any of them. This was what she had always understood, and what she had tried to build into Jon from the beginning. Not destiny, not prophecy, not the chosen one arriving at his moment. Just the right people with the right preparation doing the thing that needed doing. She heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn. Jon sat beside her. He had known since he was small that the Godswood in the morning was hers, and he had known since he was old enough to understand that the rule bent when the rule needed bending, and he had always come on the mornings when she needed company without knowing she needed it. He sat. They looked at the pool together. She said, "You should sleep." He said, "I slept 4 hours. That's enough." She said, "You're 17. He said, "Yes." She said, "You need more than 4 hours." He said, "I needed to be here first." She looked at him. He said, "The South is going to start. I know. You said so. And you're right. The question of the realm and the throne and what all of this means politically is the next thing. He looked at the pool. But right now, I wanted to be in the Godswood with you for a few minutes before all of that starts. She was quiet. She said, "A few minutes." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then the south." He said, "Then the south." They sat by the pool. The heart tree watched. The old gods, who asked nothing except witnessed. Lyanna Stark, who had survived the Tower of Joy and raised Rhaegar's son and kept the secret 17 years and gone north with her son to end the thing that had been building since before there was a dynasty to believe in prophecies, sat in the Godswood of Winterfell in the early morning and looked at the pool. Her son sat beside her. Her alive, his alive, the night's work done. The few minutes passed. She stood. She said, "Right, the south." He stood. He said, "The south." They went inside together.